On Mother's Day, in front of his wife's entire family, my son handed his mother-in-law a bottle of wine worth $5,000. Then he turned to me, smiled the same easy smile he'd give a stranger, and handed me a $9 gas station gift card. I said thank you. I smiled. I finished my lunch, hugged everyone goodbye, and drove home in complete silence. Once I got inside, I made exactly one phone call. 4 days later, my son called me 82 times in a single afternoon, begging me to stop. His company's accounts were frozen solid. He had absolutely no idea I owned 3/4 of it. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, where are you watching from and how did you find this channel? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it genuinely means the world to me. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. My name is Yvonne Brown. I'm 67 years old, a widow, and for 41 years I worked as a financial controller for a regional bank here in Nashville. The kind of career built on catching the one number in 10,000 that quietly didn't belong. When my son Marcus wanted to start his own marketing agency 12 years ago, I gave him the money to do it. I just never told him exactly how I structured it or exactly how much of it still legally belonged to me. I never planned to use that ownership. I certainly never imagined I'd need to, right up until the Mother's Day my son handed a stranger's mother $5,000 in wine, and handed his own mother $9. I want to tell you exactly how we got to that lunch table because the gas card wasn't really where this story started. It only felt that way to Marcus. To understand exactly how much that gas card cost my son, you have to understand what it took to get an invitation to Diana Whitfield's table in the first place. Marcus met Vanessa 9 years ago at a marketing conference in Atlanta, and I remember the particular excitement in his voice when he called me afterward. Not about the woman herself at first, but about her family. Mom, her mother's Diana Whitfield, he'd said, as though the name alone should mean something to me, and when I admitted it didn't, he'd explained, with a kind of breathless reverence I hadn't heard from him since he was small and excited about a new toy, that Diana had built one of the largest independent real estate development firms in Nashville from nothing, that she sat on the boards of half the city's cultural institutions. That meeting her felt like meeting someone important in a way he clearly hoped might rub off on him simply through proximity. I want to be honest that I didn't think much of it at the time, beyond the ordinary hope any mother has that her son has found someone he loves. It was only over the following years, watching Marcus and Vanessa's relationship develop into marriage, that I began noticing something in my son shifting in ways that unsettled me more than I let myself admit at the time. He started dressing differently first, small things. A watch he mentioned had cost more than his first car, a wardrobe considerably more polished than the practical, comfortable clothes he'd worn his whole life before Vanessa. He started talking about positioning and perception, in ways that sounded less like marketing language and more like a man auditioning for a role he desperately wanted to be cast in. And he started gradually arranging his calendar around Diana's schedule rather than mine, holidays and birthdays quietly shifting toward whatever gathering Diana was hosting that particular year, with visits to me squeezed in around the edges, shorter each time, always with some version of an apology about how busy things had gotten. I told myself for years that this was simply what happened when children married into different worlds, that some adjustment period was natural, that Marcus would eventually settle into a version of himself that honored both families equally, once the initial excitement of Diana's wealth and polish wore into something more ordinary. I understand now, looking back, that I was giving him considerably more benefit of the doubt than the pattern actually deserved. That Mother's Day, the invitation came from Vanessa, warm and enthusiastic in the way she always was with me, at least on the surface. Diana's hosting everyone at Belle Meade this year, she said. It'll be wonderful, Yvonne. You'll finally get to see the new sunroom she had built. I arrived at Diana's estate a little before noon, a sprawling stone house set back from the road behind iron gates, the kind of property that made my own comfortable, paid-off house feel almost apologetically modest by comparison, though I want to be clear I never once felt ashamed of what I had. I'd built my own life carefully, deliberately, the same way I'd built every account I'd ever managed professionally, and I'd never needed a house like Diana's to feel secure in what I'd accomplished. Diana greeted me warmly enough. The particular gracious warmth of a woman who has never once had to consider whether her own worth might be questioned by anyone in a room. "Yvonne, so glad you could make it," she said, air-kissing my cheek before moving on to greet the next arriving guest with identical enthusiasm. The lunch itself unfolded pleasantly enough at first. Seated around a long table on Diana's new sunroom terrace, Marcus considerably more animated and talkative than I'd seen him in months, laughing loudly at something Victor. "No, that's a different story entirely, forgive me, there was no Victor here," laughing loudly at something Diana's husband Gerald said, refilling wine glasses with an eagerness that struck me even then as slightly performative. It was near the end of the meal, once dessert had been cleared, that Marcus stood, tapping his glass gently for attention, and announced he had gifts for both mothers present. He turned to Diana first. "I know how much you appreciate a truly special vintage," he said, producing a beautifully wrapped bottle from beneath the table with the particular flourish of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this moment. "This is a 1959 Dom Perignon. I had to call in more favors than I'd like to admit to track one down." Diana's eyes widened with genuine delight, and I watched her examine the bottle with the practiced appreciation of someone who understood exactly what it represented, both in taste and in cost. "Marcus, this is extraordinary. You shouldn't have." "Nothing's too much for you," Marcus said, and I remember the warmth in his voice, genuine and unguarded in a way I hadn't heard him speak to me in longer than I wanted to admit. He turned to me next, reaching into his jacket pocket, and produced a small paper gift card, the kind you'd grab off a rack at a gas station checkout counter without a second thought. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," he said, handing it to me with a quick, easy smile before turning back to continue his conversation with Gerald about the wine. I looked down at the card in my hand. $9 printed clearly on its face, still in its plastic sleeve. I sat with that card for a long moment, feeling the eyes of the table shift briefly toward me and then away, the particular awkward silence of people who've noticed something uncomfortable and decided collectively not to name it. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. Diana, to her credit, looked briefly, genuinely uncomfortable herself, though she said nothing. I smiled. "I think my son." I told him it was thoughtful, and I meant in some strange way that it was thoughtful of exactly how little consideration he'd actually given the two mothers seated at that table, and exactly how clearly, without meaning to say a single word about it, he'd shown me precisely where I stood in the careful hierarchy he'd built around his new life. I finished my lunch. I hugged everyone goodbye. And I drove home to my own quiet house with a $9 gas card sitting on the passenger seat beside me, understanding with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself in years, exactly what I needed to do next. I sat at my own kitchen table that Mother's Day evening for a long while before I picked up the phone, the gas card still sitting where I'd set it down, and I found myself thinking back, further than I had in years, to the spring Marcus first came to me with an idea he was too nervous to fully believe in himself. He was 26 then, working a mid-level position at a marketing firm downtown. Restless in the particular way ambitious young people get restless when they can see clearly the shape of a life they want but not yet the path toward it. He'd come to dinner one Sunday quieter than usual, and it took him nearly the whole meal before he finally worked up the nerve to tell me what he'd been turning over. "I want to start my own agency," he said. "I've got clients who'd follow me if I left. I know the industry well enough by now. I just don't have the capital to do it properly. Banks won't touch a business plan from someone without collateral, and I don't want to ask you for a loan I might not be able to pay back." I remember watching my son across that table, 26 years old, trying so hard to sound confident about a decision that clearly terrified him, and I felt in that moment the particular ache every parent feels watching a child stand at the edge of something they desperately want but aren't yet certain they deserve. I didn't offer him a loan. I want to explain why, because I think it matters enormously to understanding everything that came afterward. I had spent by that point nearly 30 years as a bank controller, and I understood better than most people ever have reason to understand exactly how personal loans between family members tend to poison relationships over time. The awkward reminders, the resentment that builds on both sides, the way money owed slowly recolors every ordinary interaction between two people who once simply loved each other without any ledger between them. Instead, I proposed something different, something I'd thought through carefully during the 2 weeks after that dinner before I ever raised it with him. I would provide the capital Marcus needed, not as a loan, but as an investment, structured through a private holding company I'd formed specifically for the purpose. Brownstone Holdings, named for the street I'd grown up on as a girl in Ohio. A small private joke I never fully explained to anyone. Brownstone Holdings would own a majority stake in whatever business Marcus built, and I would remain deliberately a silent partner. No involvement in daily operations, no interference in his decisions, simply a financial structure sitting quietly in the background. "You'll run it completely as your own," I told him the day I finally proposed the arrangement. "I don't want you feeling like this is your mother's business with your name on the door. I want you building something real, something you're proud of, without ever having to explain yourself to me about it." What I didn't tell him, and what my attorney at the time, a careful, thorough man named Harold Whitaker, who's remained my attorney to this day, structured very deliberately into the paperwork, was the exact percentage of ownership Brownstone Holdings would retain. 75%, controlling and complete, with Marcus holding the remaining 25% as founder and operator. Harold had advised me gently that I might consider structuring it closer to 50-50, something that would feel more like a genuine partnership rather than a controlling interest disguised as generosity. I remember exactly what I told him. "I'm not doing this because I don't trust my son," I said. "I'm doing this because I understand better than he does right now exactly how quickly a young business can go sideways, and exactly how much protection matters when there's real money and real risk involved. If something ever goes wrong, mismanagement, bad decisions, anything that threatens what I've put into this, I want the legal standing to step in and protect it for his sake as much as mine." Harold had nodded slowly, understanding, I think, something I hadn't yet fully admitted even to myself. That some part of me even then sensed that Marcus's ambition might eventually outpace his judgment, and that loving him well meant building in a safeguard he'd hopefully never need, rather than simply trusting blindly and hoping for the best. I structured the family home the same careful way. Several years later, once Marcus and Vanessa decided to buy together rather than continue renting, I contributed the down payment as a gift, but I placed the property itself into a family trust one controlled, with Marcus named as beneficiary rather than outright owner. A structure Harold explained would protect the asset from creditors, from any future business complications, and yes, though I didn't say it aloud even to Harold at the time, from any marriage that might not last as long as everyone hoped it would. I never told Marcus any of this in detail. I told him simply that I was helping him get started, that the paperwork was handled properly by professionals, that he shouldn't worry about the specifics because I had it taken care of. He'd signed what needed signing, trusting me completely, the way a son trusts a mother who has never once given him reason to doubt her intentions. I want to be honest that some part of my silence over those 12 years came from exactly the generosity I'd always told myself it did, wanting Marcus to feel like the success was entirely his own, wanting to protect his pride, wanting him to build genuine confidence rather than always wondering how much of his achievement he actually owed to his mother's money sitting quietly behind it. But sitting at my kitchen table that Mother's Day evening, turning a $9 gas card over in my hands, I understood something else about that silence too, something I hadn't fully let myself examine before. I had built myself considerable protection and considerable power, and I had never once used any of it, not through years of watching my son's priorities shift steadily away from me, not through birthdays and holidays quietly rearranged around Diana's calendar instead of mine. I had been patient. I had given him the benefit of the doubt again and again, telling myself it was simply the natural adjustment of a son building his own family. I understood that evening that patience had quietly curdled into something closer to being taken entirely for granted, and that the gas card sitting on my table wasn't really the injury at all. It was simply the first time Marcus had made that fact impossible for me to keep pretending I hadn't noticed. I picked up the phone and called Harold Whitaker. Harold picked up on the second ring the way he always had in the 19 years I'd known him, and I could hear, even through the particular flatness of a phone line, the immediate shift in his attention once I told him I needed to see him properly, not just a quick call. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing. Whatever this is, even I can hear in your voice it's not nothing." I didn't sleep especially well that night, turning over 12 years of quiet decisions and quieter accommodations, but I arrived at Harold's downtown office a little before 8 the next morning with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel given how little rest I'd gotten. Harold's office hadn't changed much since he'd first drawn up the Brownstone Holdings paperwork. The same heavy oak desk, the same wall of law books he genuinely did still consult, unlike some attorneys I'd known who kept them purely for appearance. I told him everything start to finish. The years of Marcus's calendar quietly reshaping itself around Diana's schedule. The Mother's Day lunch at Balmead. The Dom Perignon and the $9 gas card, and the particular silence at that table once everyone had seen it happen and decided, collectively, to look away rather than acknowledge it. Harold listened without interrupting, the same careful stillness he'd always brought to serious conversations, and when I finished he sat back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "Yvonne," he said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're actually asking me. Are you here because you want to explore your legal options, or because you've already decided what you want to do and you need me to help you execute it properly?" I thought about that question carefully before I answered, because I understood it mattered considerably to how the rest of this conversation would unfold. "I think I've already decided," I told him. "I just don't fully know yet what the right way to do this looks like. I don't want to destroy my son, Harold. I want him to understand clearly and completely exactly what he's been taking for granted, and I want him to have the chance to actually become someone worth what I invested in him. But I'm no longer willing to simply wait and hope that happens on its own." Harold nodded slowly and reached for a thick folder that I recognized with a small jolt as the original Brownstone Holdings paperwork, still carefully maintained after all these years. "Let's start with what you actually have standing to do," he said. "As majority owner holding 75% of the LLC, you retain full legal authority to review the company's financial records at any time, without needing Marcus's permission or even advance notice, under the operating agreement we structured originally. If that review reveals mismanagement, misuse of company funds for personal expenses, financial decisions made without proper authorization, anything that constitutes a genuine breach of his fiduciary responsibility as operator, you have clear legal grounds to intervene directly, up to and including freezing company accounts pending a formal review, and reasserting direct operational control if the mismanagement is significant enough. I want that review done properly," I told him. "Not assumptions, not suspicion. I want to know factually whether there's actually been mismanagement, or whether I'm simply looking for justification because I'm hurt. I want to explain something about that particular request, because I think it matters to understanding the kind of correction I was actually seeking." I hadn't called Harold that morning purely out of anger, however real that anger genuinely was. Some steadier part of me, the same part that had spent 41 years insisting on verified numbers before drawing any conclusion, needed to know the intervention I was about to set in motion was actually justified by fact, not simply by wounded feelings dressed up as financial concern. Harold brought in a forensic accountant within the week, a careful, thorough woman named Priscilla Doyle who specialized in exactly this kind of review, and it took her just under 10 days to compile findings that landed considerably harder than I'd braced myself for. Over the preceding 18 months, Marcus had authorized $43,000 in company expenses that Priscilla's report characterized, in careful professional language, as having no clearly documented business purpose consistent with the company's stated operations. The specifics, once Harold walked me through them, told their own story clearly enough. A weekend trip to Charleston charged to the company as a client retreat that Priscilla's investigation showed had involved no actual clients, only Marcus, Vanessa, and Diana. A membership at the same exclusive golf club Gerald belonged to, justified in the expense records as networking overhead. 3 separate gifts purchased for Diana across the preceding year, each one run through the company's books as client relations, despite Diana never once having been a client, vendor, or business contact of Brownstone Marketing in any documented capacity. "This isn't simply poor judgment," Harold told me once he'd walked me through Priscilla's full report. "This is a pattern of using company funds to finance his personal relationship with his in-laws, disguised through improper expense categorization. Depending on how you want to proceed, this alone would give you more than sufficient grounds to intervene." I sat with that finding for a long while, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple vindication. 12 years of careful, patient investment, and my son had spent the last 18 months quietly funding his pursuit of Diana Whitfield's approval with money that was never fully his to spend that way in the first place. "I want to move forward," I told Harold. "Carefully and properly, exactly the way we built this structure to allow. But Harold, I want you to understand something important before we do. I'm not doing this to punish him permanently. I'm doing this because I think, somewhere underneath everything Marcus has become chasing Diana's world, there's still a version of my son worth fighting for. I want to give him the chance to prove that's true." Harold nodded, already reaching for the paperwork that would formally initiate the account freeze, and I understood, watching him work, that whatever came next would move considerably faster, and considerably more completely, than my son had any reason to expect. Harold advised me it would take 3 business days for the formal freeze notice to process through Brownstone Marketing's bank, and he suggested gently that I might want to prepare myself for how quickly and how loudly Marcus would likely react once it did. I didn't fully understand what he meant until my phone began ringing that Thursday morning, a little before 9, Marcus's name lighting up the screen with a frequency that felt, within the first hour alone, almost frantic. I let the first several calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed a little time to steady myself before I spoke with him directly, understanding that whatever conversation came next would likely be one of the hardest of both our lives. By early afternoon I'd counted 11 missed calls. By evening the number had climbed past 30. Harold had warned me this might happen, explaining that the freeze notice, once it hit the bank, would have prevented Marcus from accessing payroll accounts, vendor payment accounts, essentially every financial mechanism his day-to-day business required to function, effective immediately and without any advance warning to him personally, exactly as the original operating agreement allowed. I finally answered on the 41st call, a little before 8 that evening, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. "Mom, thank God," Marcus said, his voice carrying a raw, unguarded panic I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager and had wrecked his first car. "Something's happened with the company accounts. Everything's frozen. I can't run payroll. I can't pay a single vendor. I don't understand what's going on. The bank keeps referencing some kind of legal hold tied to Brownstone Holdings, but I don't even know what that is." I felt my chest tighten hearing the genuine fear in his voice, and I understood in that moment exactly how much this conversation was going to cost both of us. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I think it's time we talked properly in person with Harold present. I don't think this is something we should try to sort through over the phone." "Mom, I don't have time for a meeting," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I have 12 employees who need to be paid by Friday. I have vendors threatening to pull contracts. I need to understand what legal hold this is and how to get it lifted today, not next week." "Harold's office," I told him, giving him the address and a time 2 days out, the earliest slot Harold's schedule genuinely allowed. "Bring Vanessa if you'd like. I think, given everything, she deserves to understand what's happening too." He called 82 times in total over the following 4 days, according to Harold's own careful count once we compared notes afterward, though I stopped answering after that first Thursday evening conversation, understanding that further calls before the scheduled meeting would only escalate an already difficult situation without accomplishing anything productive. I did text him once briefly the day before our meeting. "I love you. I'll see you Tuesday. We'll get through this together." He didn't respond. Harold called me the day before the meeting with an update that added a layer I hadn't fully anticipated. "Priscilla's continued review turned up something else you should know before Tuesday," he said. "Marcus attempted yesterday to secure an emergency business loan against the company to cover payroll, using Brownstone Marketing's assets as collateral. The loan officer, standard practice for a loan of that size, pulled the company's full ownership records as part of underwriting." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Yvonne, I believe your son learned for the first time exactly how the company's ownership was actually structured, from a stranger at a bank, rather than from either of us directly." I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling a particular grief settle over me that I hadn't fully anticipated. I had wanted Marcus to learn the truth from me in a controlled setting with Harold present to explain the legal specifics clearly and calmly. Instead, he'd apparently discovered, in the middle of a panicked attempt to save his company, that his mother owned 3/4 of everything he'd spent 12 years believing was entirely his own, learning it from a loan officer's paperwork rather than from any conversation, any explanation, any context that might have softened even slightly how devastating that discovery must have felt. "How did he react?" I asked Harold, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. "The loan officer described him as visibly shaken," Harold said. "He apparently asked to see the ownership documentation directly, confirmed the 75% figure himself, and left without completing any further paperwork." Harold's voice softened slightly. "Yvonne, I think by Tuesday your son isn't simply going to be angry about frozen accounts. I think he's going to be reckoning with something considerably larger about his entire understanding of the last 12 years of his own life." I thought about that warning carefully over the following day, understanding that whatever I'd hoped Tuesday's meeting might accomplish now carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. I had wanted this correction to feel firm but controlled, a clear demonstration of consequences delivered with love still visible underneath it. I worried now that Marcus would arrive at Harold's office already convinced, before I'd said a single word, that everything about our relationship over the past 12 years had been some kind of quiet deception rather than the protective generosity I'd always genuinely intended it to be. I called Harold back that evening with one final request before Tuesday's meeting. "I want to speak first," I told him. "Before anyone raises the financial specifics, before we discuss the expense findings, before any of the legal mechanics. I want the chance to explain in my own words exactly why I structured things this way 12 years ago, and exactly what it actually meant." "I'll make sure you have that chance," Harold promised. "Yvonne, for what it's worth, I think that's exactly the right instinct. Whatever else happens Tuesday, I think your son needs to hear directly from you that this was never really about control at all." I hung up that evening and sat for a long while in my own quiet living room, thinking about the boy who used to run to me with skinned knees, and the man he'd become, currently somewhere across town discovering that his entire adult success had been quietly protected by a mother he'd handed a $9 gas card in front of a room full of people who mattered more to him lately than she did. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough, and I dreaded it more than almost anything I could remember dreading in years. Harold's conference room felt considerably smaller that Tuesday morning than it ever had during our previous meetings, though I understood the room itself hadn't changed at all. Only the weight of what was about to happen inside it. Marcus arrived first alone, which surprised me slightly given that I'd invited Vanessa to attend as well. He looked, sitting down across the table from me, considerably more haggard than the polished, confident man who'd handed a stranger's mother $5,000 in wine just 2 weeks earlier, dark circles beneath his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that told me he hadn't slept much better than I had. Vanessa's coming separately, he said, his voice flat, careful. She's bringing her mother. I felt something tighten in my own chest hearing that, understanding immediately that Diana's presence would change the shape of this conversation considerably, though I said nothing beyond a simple nod, waiting for Harold to guide us through what came next. Vanessa and Diana arrived together perhaps 10 minutes later. Diana dressed impeccably as always, her expression carrying a controlled curiosity that told me she genuinely didn't yet understand the full scope of what this meeting concerned. Vanessa looked pale, uncertain, glancing between her husband and me with an expression I recognized as someone caught entirely off guard by a crisis she didn't yet have the context to fully process. Harold opened the meeting with careful, measured formality, explaining briefly that this concerned a financial and legal matter related to Brownstone Marketing's ownership structure, before turning the floor over to me exactly as he'd promised. I looked at my son directly, and I found the words I'd rehearsed the night before came out steadier than I expected. Marcus, 12 years ago when you came to me wanting to start this company, I made a decision I should have explained to you more fully at the time, and I take responsibility for the confusion that decision has clearly caused. I structured my investment through a holding company, Brownstone Holdings, which retained 75% ownership of what became Brownstone Marketing. I did this for 2 reasons. I wanted you to build genuine confidence running your own business without constantly feeling indebted to your mother. And I wanted the legal standing to protect what I'd invested for both our sakes, if anything ever went seriously wrong. You owned my company this whole time, Marcus said quietly, and you never told me. I told you I was helping you get started, I said. I understand now that wasn't the same as full honesty, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise sitting here today. I made a choice 12 years ago to protect you from a burden I thought might weigh on you, and I understand now that choice also kept you from fully understanding the actual foundation your success was built on. Diana, who had been listening with an increasingly guarded expression, finally spoke. I'm sorry, I need to understand something clearly. Are you saying Marcus doesn't actually own his own company? Marcus owns 25% of it as founder and operator, Harold said, stepping in smoothly. Brownstone Holdings, controlled by Mrs. Brown, has held the majority interest since the company's founding. I watched something shift visibly across Diana's face, a recalculation happening in real time that I recognized instantly, having spent decades watching people absorb difficult financial news across countless professional conversations. Whatever version of Marcus she'd believed she was welcoming into her family, successful, self-made, a rising player in Nashville's business world, was rearranging itself, right in front of her, into something considerably smaller and more precarious. Harold moved next into Priscilla's findings, laying out the $43,000 in improperly categorized expenses with the same careful, unemotional precision he brought to everything, walking through the Charleston trip, the golf club membership, the gifts purchased for Diana, and run through the company's books as client relations despite no legitimate business connection. I watched Marcus's face as each item was read aloud, watched the particular sinking recognition of a man realizing exactly how thoroughly his own careless decisions had documented themselves. And I watched, too, something shift in Diana's expression as she understood, piece by piece, that the golf club membership meant to impress her husband, the gifts meant to court her own favor, had all been funded improperly, through money that legally belonged largely to his mother rather than to Marcus himself. I want to be direct about where this leaves things, Harold said once he'd finished walking through the findings. Given the scope and pattern of these expenses, Mrs. Brown has clear legal grounds, under the original operating agreement, to assume direct operational control of the company, effective immediately pending further review. You can't just take my company, Marcus said, his voice cracking now, some of the shock finally breaking into something raw. It was never entirely your company to begin with, Marcus, I said gently, though I made myself hold his gaze as I said it. I understand how painful that is to hear. I understand it probably feels like a betrayal hearing it this way after 12 years of believing something different. But I need you to understand something else clearly right now in this room. The freeze isn't punishment for its own sake. It's a consequence, directly connected to specific decisions you made, decisions I have documented proof of. Diana stood abruptly, smoothing her jacket with the particular composure of a woman recalibrating her position in real time. Vanessa, I think we should give Marcus and his mother some privacy to work through this. I watched my son's face as Diana said it, watched him understand in that exact moment, something I suspect some part of him had already begun sensing even before she spoke, that whatever warmth Diana had shown him across 9 years of family gatherings had been considerably more conditional than he'd allowed himself to believe. Diana, Marcus said, and I heard in his voice a genuine, desperate hope that she might stay, might reassure him, might prove that whatever mattered to her about him extended beyond the version of success he'd worked so hard to project. I can explain all of this. This doesn't change anything, does it? Diana's expression softened briefly into something almost apologetic. I think you and your mother have quite a lot to discuss, Marcus. Vanessa, I'll wait for you in the car. She left the room without another word, her heels clicking evenly against the hardwood floor, and I watched my son's face as the door closed behind her, understanding with a grief that surprised me in its intensity, exactly how completely his entire carefully constructed world had just begun collapsing in front of him. Chapter 6. The Fairweather Family. Vanessa lingered in the doorway a long moment after her mother left, her expression caught somewhere between loyalty to her husband and the same visible recalculation I'd watched cross Diana's face minutes earlier. I need some time to think, she finally said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. This is a lot, Marcus. I need to process it. She left without hugging him, without the small, ordinary gesture of comfort I imagined she'd have offered without hesitation 2 weeks earlier, and I watched my son's shoulders drop slightly as the door closed behind her, understanding that he'd registered that absence as clearly as I had. Harold gave us a few minutes alone once the room had emptied, stepping out under the pretense of retrieving additional documents, and I sat across the table from my son in a silence that felt heavier than almost anything I could remember between us. Diana left, Marcus finally said, staring at the table rather than at me. The second things got complicated, she just left. I noticed, I said gently. 9 years, Mom. 9 years of dinners and holidays and trying to prove I belonged at that table, and the moment she found out I wasn't exactly who she thought I was, she couldn't get out of the room fast enough. His voice cracked slightly on the last few words, and I watched him struggle visibly to hold something together that had clearly been fraying for longer than just this single afternoon. I didn't say what I was thinking in that moment, though I suspect Marcus understood it anyway, sitting there in the wreckage of a meeting that had exposed considerably more than just financial mismanagement. Diana's swift exit hadn't been an isolated reaction to a single difficult conversation. It had been, I think, an honest revelation of exactly how conditional her warmth toward my son had always actually been, dependent entirely on the version of success he'd worked so hard to perform for her. What followed over the next 10 days moved with a speed that surprised even Harold, I think, given his considerable experience with families navigating exactly this kind of upheaval. Vanessa called Marcus 4 days after that meeting, according to what he told me later, to inform him she'd retained her own attorney and intended to file for divorce. She'd apparently spent those 4 days at her mother's estate, and I understood, hearing the timeline, that whatever conversations had happened during that stay had likely shaped her decision considerably more than any private reflection of her own might have. Diana, I suspect, had made her own calculations quickly and clearly once the full shape of Marcus's financial reality became apparent, and I imagine she'd shared those calculations with her daughter without much hesitation. The divorce filing itself moved quickly, Vanessa's attorney apparently confident, at least initially, that a straightforward division of marital assets would net her a comfortable settlement given 9 years of marriage and what she'd believed, until recently, was a genuinely successful shared business venture. It was during the discovery process, Harold told me, that Vanessa's attorney encountered the same revelation Marcus's loan officer had stumbled onto weeks earlier. That Brownstone Marketing, the business Vanessa had assumed constituted a substantial marital asset, was in fact 75% owned by a holding company entirely outside the marriage, with Marcus's own 25% stake currently frozen and under review for financial mismanagement. The family home similarly revealed itself under scrutiny to be held not in Marcus and Vanessa's joint names at all, but within a family trust one controlled, with Marcus named only as a conditional beneficiary rather than an outright owner. There's very little of genuine value to actually divide, Harold explained to me, once Vanessa's attorney had completed the discovery process and reached out to negotiate terms. Marcus's remaining assets amount to some savings, a vehicle and personal property. Vanessa's attorney has indicated they intend to pursue the divorce regardless, but the settlement discussions are proceeding considerably differently than I suspect either she or her attorney initially anticipated. I felt no particular satisfaction hearing that update, though I understand it would have been reasonable if I had. What I felt instead was a tired, complicated grief for my son, watching from a careful distance as a marriage he'd built his entire adult identity around dissolved almost entirely on the basis of what he did or didn't have to offer materially, rather than anything resembling the deeper commitment marriage is supposed to represent. Marcus called me himself about 2 weeks after that first meeting, his voice steadier than it had been that day in Harold's office, though carrying a rawness that told me he was still very much in the process of absorbing everything that had happened. Vanessa's staying with her mother permanently, he told me. The divorce is moving forward. I'm going to need to find somewhere else to live once everything with the house settlement is finalized. He paused and I heard something shift in his voice, something closer to honesty than I'd heard from him in longer than I could remember. Mom, I keep thinking about that Mother's Day. About the wine and the gas card. I keep asking myself how I became someone who would do that to you, and I don't have a good answer yet. I don't need you to have a good answer right now, I told him honestly. I need you to actually sit with the question, Marcus, rather than rushing toward whatever explanation makes you feel better about it fastest. That's part of what comes next if you're willing to do the work. What does that actually look like? He asked quietly. What do you need from me now? I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, understanding that whatever I said next would shape the entire direction of what came after this devastating, necessary reckoning. I told him, it's time we talked about what it would actually take to earn back some real stake in that company. Not given to you out of guilt or sentiment, Marcus. Earned properly, the same way I once hoped you'd have built it all along. Marcus came to my house the following Sunday, the first time he'd sat at my own kitchen table in longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge, and I made the same pot roast I'd made for his birthday every year since he was a boy, understanding that some conversations go easier with ordinary comfort surrounding them. We didn't talk business through most of the meal. I asked him how he was managing, practically, where he was staying, whether he'd found anywhere permanent yet, how the divorce proceedings were unfolding. He answered honestly without the polish I'd grown used to hearing from him over the past several years, describing a small extended-stay hotel room he'd moved into, the particular strangeness of packing up a life that had unraveled so completely in the span of a few weeks. It was over coffee, once the dishes were cleared, that I finally raised what I'd been thinking through carefully since our phone call. I want to propose something, I told him, and I want you to understand clearly that this isn't a punishment, though I imagine parts of it will feel that way. I want to give you the chance to earn back a stake in Brownstone Marketing. Not the full company and not simply handed to you out of guilt or sentiment. Earned. What would that actually require? Marcus asked, his voice careful, the particular wariness of a man who'd already learned, painfully, not to assume anything about how the next weeks of his life might unfold. $850,000, I told him. Raised entirely on your own within 30 days, to buy back a 25% stake in the company. Not borrowed from friends, not financed through any arrangement that simply shifts the debt somewhere else. earned and saved through your own effort in a way I can verify clearly. I watched him absorb that figure, watched the particular mathematics of it settle over his face as he worked through, I imagine, exactly how far that number sat from anything his current circumstances could reasonably produce. Mom, that's an impossible amount of money to raise in 30 days. I don't have anywhere close to that saved, and with the divorce proceedings, whatever I do have is going to be tied up for months. I understand it's a difficult target, I said. I want to be honest with you, Marcus, that the difficulty is somewhat the point. I don't need you to reach the exact number. I need to see, clearly and honestly, what you're actually willing to do, and what you actually value, once the easy version of your life is no longer available to you. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice had shifted into a resolve I hadn't heard from him in years. What happens if I don't reach it? He asked. What happens if I fall short? We'll see, I told him honestly. I'm not going to tell you the answer to that right now because I think knowing it in advance would change how genuinely you approach the next 30 days. I want you to give this everything you actually have, Marcus, not calculate toward whatever minimum guarantees a particular outcome. He agreed that same evening, and over the following days I watched, mostly from a careful distance, as my son began dismantling the visible markers of the life he'd spent the past 9 years building. He sold the watch he'd once mentioned casually had cost more than his first car, listing it himself through an online marketplace rather than asking anyone for help navigating the process. He sold his car next, a sleek, recently financed sedan he'd been particularly proud of, replacing it with a used compact he paid for outright in cash, considerably less impressive but entirely his own. He took a position washing dishes at a restaurant downtown, working the closing shift most nights, a job Harold happened to mention had been reported to him by a mutual acquaintance who'd seen Marcus there, still in his kitchen whites, well past midnight some evenings. During the day he worked a call center position fielding customer service complaints for a modest hourly wage, the kind of work I don't think he'd done since he was a teenager, if he'd ever done work quite that unglamorous at all. I didn't check in constantly during those 30 days. Understanding that hovering would undermine exactly the kind of genuine, independent effort I was hoping to see. But I heard pieces of it from Harold, from a mutual friend who mentioned running into Marcus at the call center's parking lot looking exhausted but determined, from Marcus himself during the brief, occasional calls he made simply to check in rather than to ask for anything. I fell asleep on my lunch break yesterday, he told me during one of those calls, somewhere around the 2-week mark, his voice carrying an exhaustion that sounded, to my careful ear, considerably more honest than anything I'd heard from him in years. I haven't worked this many hours in a week since I was in college, Mom. I forgot what this actually feels like. How does it feel? I asked him. He was quiet a long moment before he answered. Humbling, he finally said. I keep thinking about all the people who've worked jobs like this their whole lives, without ever having some safety net waiting at the end of 30 days if it doesn't work out. I don't know how to fully explain what that's done to how I've been thinking about everything. I didn't tell him in that moment how much that particular observation meant to me, how closely it echoed exactly the kind of reckoning I'd hoped, quietly, this entire ordeal might eventually produce in him. I simply told him I was proud of the effort I could see him making, and let the conversation end there, understanding that whatever transformation was actually happening in my son needed room to continue developing on its own, without my interference shaping it prematurely. The 30 days drew to a close on a Thursday evening, and Marcus asked if he could come by my house that Friday to report formally, exactly where he'd landed. I found myself waiting for him that Friday afternoon, considerably more nervous than I expected to feel about a number I'd already told him. Honestly, wasn't really the point of any of this at all. Marcus arrived Friday afternoon carrying a folder, the particular formality of it striking me immediately, given that I hadn't asked him to document anything in writing. He'd clearly decided on his own that this final accounting deserved the same seriousness I imagine he'd once brought to important client presentations, back when presentations were still the currency he traded in most comfortably. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table that had hosted every significant conversation of this entire ordeal, and I watched him open the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady. $86,000, he said, sliding a summary sheet across the table toward me. That's what I raised. I know it's considerably short of 150. I looked over the document carefully, understanding from decades of reviewing exactly this kind of accounting, precisely how much effort sat behind each line. The watch sold for $11,000. The car netting $19,000 after paying off what remained on the financing. 6 weeks of combined wages from the dish pit and the call center, totaling just under $31,000 once he'd covered his own modest living expenses at the extended stay hotel. The remainder came from what appeared to be nearly everything else of value Marcus owned. A watch collection beyond the first piece, several pairs of expensive shoes sold through a resale service, even, I noticed with a particular ache, his father's old fishing rod, an item I recognized immediately from the description and understood must have cost him something considerable to part with, regardless of its modest resale value. "You sold your father's fishing rod," I said quietly. "I needed every dollar I could find," Marcus said, and then more quietly, "I almost didn't. I sat with it for 2 days before I finally listed it. I kept thinking about how many mornings Dad and I spent out on the lake with that thing, and how little it would actually add to the total, and I told myself it wasn't worth it." He paused and I watched something genuine cross his face, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. "But then I thought about what you actually gave me 12 years ago, Mom, and how I paid it back by embarrassing you in front of a room full of strangers who mattered less to me than you do. The fishing rod felt like the least I could offer toward actually fixing that." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling my own composure waver slightly in a way I hadn't expected it to, given how carefully I'd prepared myself for this conversation. "There's something else," Marcus continued, reaching back into the folder. "I want you to see this too, even though it doesn't add to the total." He slid out a second document, a printed schedule of hours worked across the dish pit and call center, each shift logged carefully, dates and times recorded with the same precision I recognized, with a small, surprised warmth, as a habit he must have picked up from watching me manage household finances his entire childhood. "I worked 211 hours over these 30 days, Mom. I've never worked that many hours in a single month in my entire life, not even when I was first building the agency and telling everyone how hard I was grinding." "Tell me about the work itself," I said. "Not the numbers. What it actually felt like." He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "The dish pit was the hardest physically," he said. 12-hour shifts on my feet, hands raw by the end of most nights, coming home smelling like a restaurant no matter how many times I showered. But it was the call center that actually changed something in me, I think. Fielding complaint after complaint from people who were angry, sometimes genuinely cruel, about problems that weren't even my fault, and having to just absorb it professionally hour after hour, for a wage that wouldn't have covered a single bottle of that wine I bought Diana. His voice caught slightly on her name. I kept thinking somewhere around week 2 about every person who's ever taken a call from me at Brownstone, every vendor I might have spoken to dismissively when things weren't going my way. I don't think I understood what that actually cost people until I was the one on the other end of it. I reached across the table and took my son's hand, the same way I had through every significant crisis of his life, and I found myself in that moment, understanding with total clarity that the number sitting between us, $86,000, $64,000 short of the target I'd set, mattered considerably less than everything he'd just described. "Marcus," I said, "I need to tell you something honestly, and I need you to really hear it. I never expected you to reach $150,000 in 30 days. I don't think it was possible, and some part of me suspected that when I set the number." He looked up at me, confusion crossing his face. "Then why?" "Because I needed to see what you were actually willing to sacrifice when the goal felt impossible," I told him. Anyone can perform effort toward a target they know they'll hit comfortably. I needed to see what you'd give up and how honestly you'd work, once you understood the odds were genuinely against you. I needed to know whether you'd quietly cut corners or ask friends for loans to inflate the number, or simply give up 2 weeks and once it became clear you'd fall short. Instead, you sold your father's fishing rod and worked 211 hours in a month. And you came here today with an honest accounting rather than any attempt to dress up the number into something it wasn't. Marcus sat very still, absorbing that, and I watched tears finally, genuinely fill his eyes for the first time since this entire ordeal began. So this was never really about the money, he said slowly. The money was real, I told him. The consequences were real and I don't regret a single one of them. But Marcus, what I was actually watching for this entire time was you. Who you'd choose to become, once everything easy about your life had been stripped away. I let Marcus sit with that revelation for a long moment before I continued, watching him absorb piece by piece, that the entire 30-day ordeal had never actually been a test of arithmetic at all. I want to tell you what happens now, I said, and I want you to understand this isn't simply forgiveness handed to you because you're my son. This is a decision I've thought through carefully, based on what I've genuinely watched you do these past weeks. I reached into my own folder, one I'd prepared before he arrived, and slid a document across the table toward him. I'm restoring a 40% stake in Brownstone Marketing to you, effective immediately, held under Harold's continued oversight for the first 2 years, with standard financial reporting requirements built in that I expect you to meet without complaint. That's 15% more than you originally held, Marcus, not because you earned it back through the $86,000, but because you earned it back through everything that number actually represented. Marcus stared at the document and I watched his hands shake slightly as he read through the terms. 40%, he said quietly. Mom, I fell $64,000 short of what you asked for. I know exactly how short you fell, I told him. I also know you sold nearly everything you owned of value, worked 211 hours in a single month at jobs considerably beneath what you believed yourself capable of just weeks earlier, and came to this table today with total honesty rather than any attempt to inflate what you'd actually accomplished. That matters more to me than the number ever did. I slid a second document across the table, this one concerning the family trust. I'm also reinstating your position as beneficiary on the house, I said, with one condition I need you to understand clearly. The mortgage becomes entirely your responsibility going forward, Marcus. Not mine, not quietly absorbed into anything I'm managing on your behalf. You'll need to find somewhere to live regardless, given the divorce, but I want you to understand that whatever comes next in your life, the safety net I built for you 12 years ago isn't disappearing entirely, but it's no longer something you get to lean on without genuine responsibility attached. He nodded slowly and I watched him fold both documents carefully, the same careful precision he'd shown compiling his own accounting earlier that afternoon. Mom, he said, I don't know how to properly thank you for this. I don't know how to make up for the last several years, honestly, not just the wine and the gas card but everything underneath that. All the holidays I rearranged around Diana's schedule instead of yours. All the times I probably made you feel like you mattered less than her approval did. You don't need to make up for all of it in one conversation, I told him gently. I think that's actually part of what I want you to understand moving forward. This isn't a debt you're paying off completely today. It's a relationship we're going to keep rebuilding slowly, the same way any genuine trust gets rebuilt, through ordinary, consistent choices, rather than one grand gesture that fixes everything at once. We had dinner together that following Sunday, the first of what would become, over the coming months, a steady rebuilt tradition between us. I invited Marcus, and only Marcus, understanding clearly by then that Diana and the version of my son who'd once chased her approval so desperately were not people I intended to make room for at my own table any longer. I ran into Vanessa's mother at a restaurant last week, Marcus told me during that dinner, several weeks into his gradual rebuilding. She was polite. Distant but polite. I don't think either of us really knows what to say to the other anymore, now that there's nothing left to perform for each other. How did that feel? I asked him. He considered the question honestly before answering, the same careful reflection I'd watched him develop steadily over the preceding weeks. Strange, he said. Freeing, actually, more than I expected. I spent 9 years trying to earn a place at her table that I never actually needed to earn a place at yours for. I think I forgot somewhere in there that you'd already given me everything real that mattered 12 years ago, without ever once asking me to perform anything in exchange for it. I felt something settle in my chest hearing that, a particular quiet peace I hadn't expected to feel this fully, given how devastating the preceding months had genuinely been for both of us. Brownstone marketing rebuilt steadily over the following year, considerably more modest than it had been during its most image-conscious period, but honest in a way I think it had never quite managed to be before. Marcus reported his finances to Harold faithfully without complaint and slowly, carefully began building something that felt, watching him from a careful distance, considerably more solid than anything Diana's approval had ever offered him. I think about that Mother's Day often, sitting now at my own kitchen table with my son across from me, ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way I once feared I'd never get to experience with him again. I think about the $9 gas card still sitting in a drawer in my kitchen, kept not out of bitterness, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how close I came to simply enduring my own devaluation indefinitely, rather than finally, firmly insisting on the respect I'd spent a lifetime earning. I learned that love without boundaries teaches people exactly how little they need to give you in return, and that protecting someone's character sometimes requires taking away the comfort that's been quietly corroding it. What I gained in the end wasn't just my son's company stake restored, or even his renewed presence at my own table, though both matter to me more than I can properly express. It was a son who finally understands the difference between being given something and earning it, and a mother who learned at 67 that patience is only a virtue right up until the moment it becomes its own quiet form of self-erasure.